I work at a diner on the side of a highway that barely sees any traffic after 9 p.m. It was just another one of those nights. It was cold, and the only sound was the faint buzz of fluorescent lights as I cleaned tables. The place is small, with those typical red leather stools and a worn-out counter that's probably been there for 30 years. It was close to midnight when he walked in. Tall, skinny, maybe in his 50s, and wearing a smile that felt off. He sat at a table near the window, his back to the road. It wasn't common for anyone to show up this late, so I tried to be polite, even though there was something about him that immediately put me on edge. He didn't even look at the menu. Instead, he ordered something I'd never heard anyone ask for: beef Wellington with white truffles, paired with a glass of vintage port wine. I calmly explained that we didn't serve anything remotely like that. The most upscale item we had was maybe a cheeseburger with fries. He frowned, clearly annoyed, and said, "You people don't know what real food is. A proper restaurant would have it." I tried suggesting something from our menu, but he cut me off in this icy tone. I asked for beef Wellington, and I expected to be served. That threw me off completely. He wasn't just rude, he seemed on the verge of losing control. Still, I kept calm and told him I'd check with the chef, even though I already knew the answer. Back in the kitchen, I told the chef about the guy's order, and he laughed. "Beef Wellington? White truffles? Here? Does he think we've got a secret stash of gourmet ingredients?" It was absurd, but the guy's reaction stuck with me. There was something unshakably unsettling about him. Nervously, I headed back to the table to break the news, knowing it wouldn't go well. As I explained that we couldn't make his order, he just stared at me with that same eerie smile and said, "It will be in the kitchen when you go back." I felt a chill run down my spine but brushed it off as him just being weird. I tried to focus on finishing my shift, avoiding his table entirely. But when I went back to the kitchen, my blood ran cold. Sitting there on the stainless steel counter was a perfectly cooked beef Wellington, exactly how he described it, with a bottle of vintage port wine beside it. The smell was so rich and intense it didn't even feel real. I called the chef over, and his face mirrored my own confusion. "Is this a joke?" he asked, but we both knew it wasn't. No one had left the kitchen, and we didn't even have the ingredients to make something like that. The tension in the air was suffocating as we stood there, staring at the impossibility in front of us. I finally worked up the nerve to go back to the dining area to confront the guy, but he wasn't there. The chair he'd been sitting in was pushed back like he'd just stood up and left. I looked around the empty diner, the silence pressing in on me. I stepped outside into the cold, empty parking lot, hoping to catch sight of his car or something, but there was nothing. Just my car sitting alone in the lot. When I went back inside, the plate and wine bottle were gone from the kitchen. But no one had touched them. My heart was pounding. I rushed back to the dining area, and my stomach dropped. The plate and wine were now set neatly on the same table he had been sitting at, as if they had just been served. My blood turned to ice. The chef came up behind me, his face pale, and whispered, "Did you bring that out here?" I shook my head, unable to speak. It made no sense. None of this made any sense. Before we could figure out what to do, the lights flickered for a moment. When they came back on, the front door of the diner was wide open. Cold air rushed in, but I couldn't see anyone outside. The parking lot was still empty, and the silence was almost unbearable. I hesitated, then slowly walked to the open door, my footsteps heavy. Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, but curiosity got the better of me. I peeked out into the darkness, hoping to see him or any sign of what was going on, but there was nothing. Then, from behind me, I heard a metallic clatter from the kitchen. I froze. My pulse was racing as I forced myself to go check. In the kitchen, a knife lay on the floor, and the chef was staring at the counter. "He was here," he said, pointing to a handprint on the stainless steel surface. The print was dark and greasy, but that wasn't the worst part. The shape was all wrong. The fingers were too long, bent at unnatural angles. That detail broke any logic I was clinging to. "This is insane," I muttered, more to myself than anyone else, pulling out my phone to call the police. While waiting for them, the atmosphere grew heavier, almost unbearable. My hands trembled so badly I could barely hold the phone. The chef paced back and forth, muttering things I couldn't make out. Then we heard it, a faint dragging noise coming from the dining area. It was the sound of something being pulled across the floor. Against every instinct, I forced myself to look. The table where the plate had been served was now empty. The plate and wine bottle were shattered on the floor, as if they'd been thrown. The dragging sound continued, coming from near the entrance. When I turned toward the door, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The chair he'd been sitting in was knocked over, and there were deep gouges in the floor leading toward the open door. The marks weren't from the chair. They looked like claw marks. Before I could fully process what I was seeing, the sound of a car engine roared outside. For a second, I thought it was the police, but when I looked out, I saw an old car parked across the highway. Its headlights were on, blinding me, and the engine was idling, but no one got out. I couldn't see inside the car, and my chest tightened with dread. The headlights flashed twice, like a signal. Then I heard footsteps behind me, fast and heavy. I whipped around, expecting to see the chef, but the dining area was empty. The footsteps kept coming, louder, closing in on me. My body froze, and before I could react, something hit me hard on the shoulder, knocking me to the ground. There was no one there. Just an unbearable silence and a crushing pressure that felt like it was squeezing the air out of me. The phone in my hand was still connected to the police, but the line was dead, like it had been cut. The pressure on my chest grew worse, and I couldn't move. The sound of footsteps echoed again, this time slower, deliberate. A shadow darted across the room, unnaturally fast. Then I saw him, or at least what looked like him. The man from earlier, but his face was different now. His eyes were wide, empty, and his expression twisted with something I can only describe as inhuman. He moved closer, and I felt a terror so deep I thought I might pass out. Suddenly, blinding light flooded the diner, the headlights from the police car. The sound of their sirens cut through the tension like a lifeline. Whatever he was, or it was, disappeared in an instant, vanishing into thin air. The officers burst in, but there was no trace of him. No sign of anything except the broken plate, the overturned chair, and those claw-like marks on the floor. I always worked the night shift at this small restaurant in my town. It's a quiet place, almost hidden, where people come to grab a quick bite after work. Most of the customers are regulars, so when a new couple walked in near the end of my shift, it didn't seem like a big deal. They looked normal. The guy was in a suit, the woman in a simple black dress, both very polite. But something about the way they looked around made me uneasy. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I served them like any other customer. They ordered just a coffee and an apple pie to share. While they ate, I noticed they barely spoke to each other. They just exchanged glances, those kinds of looks that seemed to mean something. When I went to clean the nearby tables, I heard them whispering, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. By then, the restaurant was empty, and the silence made every little sound stand out. Despite the weird vibe, I didn't think much of it. Maybe they just had a bad day. They paid, thanked me, and left without much fuss. It was only when I started clearing their table to close up that I noticed the woman had left her bag hanging on the chair. I grabbed the bag without thinking too much about it, planning to keep it at the counter in case they came back for it. But as I placed it on the counter, I realized it was heavier than I expected. That's when curiosity got the better of me. Without really thinking, I unzipped the main compartment. What I found wasn't at all what I expected. Inside, there was a large, sharp knife, the kind you'd see in a chef's kitchen or a horror movie. Next to it, a roll of thick, used rope. My heart was already racing, but it was the note that made my blood run cold. It was a crumpled piece of paper, but the message was clear, my address. I can't explain what I felt in that moment. It was like all the air had been sucked out of the room. My hands were sweaty, and I felt like someone was watching me, even though I knew the place was empty. I locked the front door immediately and tried to think about what to do. I called the police, but the dispatcher sounded more skeptical than concerned. They said they'd send someone to check things out, but assured me it was probably just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? I was alone in an empty restaurant with a bag full of things that could hurt someone and a note with my address. This didn't feel like a mistake to me. After hanging up, I started pacing back and forth, trying to figure out what to do. None of it made sense. I kept looking at the front door, almost expecting the couple to show up again. The bag was still sitting there on the counter, open, like proof that I wasn't imagining things. But every minute that passed felt like an hour, and nobody came. I went to the back, where the kitchen was, and locked that door too. It was the only other way in. That's when I noticed how quiet the place had gotten. The silence was almost worse than any sound. About 15 minutes later, I saw a car park across the street. It wasn't a police car. It was a black sedan with its headlights off, and I could see two people sitting inside, but I couldn't make out their faces. My heart sank immediately. Was it the couple? Were they waiting for me to come out? I grabbed my phone to call the police again, but I froze when I saw the car's engine turn off. They didn't get out, but I could feel their eyes on me. I stood there, unsure whether to run, hide, or face them somehow. I went to the stockroom, where there was a small window facing the back parking lot. I climbed onto a chair to look outside and saw the black car still parked on the street. But now, it seemed like the person in the driver's seat had turned their head toward the back of the restaurant. There was no way they could see me through the window, but it felt like they knew exactly where I was. The stockroom was small and packed with boxes, so there wasn't much room to hide. I grabbed one of the kitchen knives and stayed there, trying to calm my breathing while I thought of a way out. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps. Not in my head. Someone was walking around the restaurant, slow and deliberate, almost dragging their feet. I tried looking out the window again, but I couldn't see anyone. The sound was coming from near the back door. My instinct told me to run there and hold the handle tight in case someone tried to come in. I stood there, gripping the door handle, waiting for something to happen. Then I heard 3 slow knocks, spaced out, like whoever was on the other side wanted to mess with me. My blood turned to ice. I couldn't move a muscle. I stayed frozen, waiting for the next sound, but the seconds dragged on, and nothing else happened. Still, I couldn't bring myself to let go of the door. Finally, I gathered enough courage to crouch down and peek through the gap at the bottom. Nothing. Just the empty parking lot, lit by the dim yellow light that barely cut through the darkness. That's when I noticed the black car was gone. I hadn't heard it leave. No sound. It was like it had vanished into thin air. At that moment, adrenaline kicked in, and I let go of the door, running to the front counter to get a better look outside. But as I got there, I almost slipped on something. It was the bag. But it wasn't on the counter where I'd left it. Now, it was lying open in the middle of the restaurant, like someone had moved it while I was locked in the back. The knife and the rope were still inside, but the note with my address was gone. The realization hit me like a truck. I wasn't alone. In full panic, I grabbed my phone to call the police again, but my hands were shaking so much that I dropped it. As I bent down to pick it up, I heard the most terrifying sound yet, footsteps coming from the front door. Not slow this time. Fast, determined, like someone was about to break in. I bolted back to the stockroom, locking the door behind me. Trapped, I pressed my ear against the door, trying to hear what was happening. More footsteps, now inside the restaurant. Whoever it was, they'd gotten in. I could hear chairs being dragged, like they were searching for me. I don't know how I managed not to scream. My hands were slippery with sweat, barely holding onto the knife I still had. I just prayed they wouldn't try the stockroom door. Then, silence again. It was worse than the noise because I knew they were still there, somewhere. Finally, I heard the front door chime, the one that rings when someone enters or exits. For a second, I thought they might have left. But something didn't add up. If they'd gone, why hadn't I heard the car leave earlier? Why was the chime so delayed? My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I held the knife tighter, unsure whether to stay hidden or take my chances. Then, light knocks on the stockroom door. Soft. Almost playful. I didn't answer. Didn't move. Just stayed frozen. The knocking stopped, and the silence returned. When I finally worked up the nerve to crack the door open, the restaurant was empty. No people, no bag, no sign anyone had been there. But on the counter, I found the missing note. This time, there was something written on the back. See you soon. I quit the next day and went straight to my parents' house. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump. I never found out who they were or what they wanted. The police didn't take it seriously, calling it a prank or a misunderstanding. But I know what I saw, what I felt. To this day, I can't step into an empty restaurant without feeling like I'm being watched. And the worst part? Whenever I'm in a crowded place, I can't help but wonder if they're there, watching me, waiting for the right moment to find me again. I work as a janitor at a small amusement park, the kind that tries to look modern but still has that old, abandoned feel to it. That day, it was my turn to clean the haunted house, one of the attractions no one likes to deal with because, honestly, the place is pretty uncomfortable. The lights are dim, and the smell of mold mixed with old dust is horrible. It was the end of the shift, almost 11 p.m., and I was just trying to get done and go home. While I was sweeping the floor near one of the dark hallways, I saw something in the corner, near the entrance to the haunted room. It was a crumpled piece of paper. I thought it was just another piece of trash left behind by the visitors, but when I opened it, I realized it was a note. At first, I didn't pay much attention. I thought it was just a prank or something accidentally left behind. The handwriting was shaky, like the person had been nervous when writing it. The note started by describing exactly where I was. You were in the haunted house, near the hallway with the old wooden bed. Do you feel like you're being watched? That's when the real discomfort hit. I looked around, trying to see if someone was hiding, but the place was empty, as usual. I kept reading, and the words got more direct. They watch you, but you pretend not to notice. At the end, the note said something that froze me. I'll see you at your house later. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at that note like it was about to explode at any moment. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a sick joke from some bored teenager. But I couldn't shake the discomfort that started growing inside me. I felt exposed, like someone was watching me right then and there. I looked around again, this time more carefully. The shadows cast by the weak lights from the lamps gave life to the moldy walls, but there was no one. Still, my heart was pounding, and the idea of staying there alone made me want to finish cleaning as quickly as possible. I folded the note and stuffed it in my pocket, trying to forget about it. I finished sweeping the hallway, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Every little sound the building made, the creaks of the old structure, the buzz of the lights, seemed amplified. When I was finally done, I rushed out of the haunted house, the keys shaking in my hand. I threw the cleaning supplies in the storage room, clocked out, and headed straight to the parking lot. It was almost midnight, and the park was completely empty. The silence was suffocating. I got in my car, locked the doors, and only relaxed a little when I left the parking lot. The drive home was short, but that night felt like it would never end. Every car light I saw made me check the rearview mirror, like someone might be following me. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, but the note still weighed heavy in my pocket. When I got to my street, I felt a momentary relief. My house was dark, just like always, since my wife and kids had gone to visit their grandparents for the weekend. I parked, got out of the car, and looked around before going inside, a habit I'd never had before. Everything seemed normal, until I put the key in the door. As soon as I opened it, I noticed a light on in the living room. My heart stopped. I'm sure all the lights were off when I left that morning. I stood in the doorway, holding the door open with one hand, trying to hear any noise inside. Everything was silent. I took a deep breath, forced myself to go in, and headed straight for the living room. The lamp was on, but everything else seemed untouched. My mind tried to find logical explanations. Maybe I forgot to turn it off. Maybe there was a power surge. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. With trembling hands, I turned off the lamp and started checking the rooms, one by one. The kitchen was exactly how I left it. The kids' room, empty and tidy. The bathroom, the same. But when I got to my bedroom, I felt that discomfort again. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air in there felt heavier. I can't explain it, but it was like the room had been changed, as if someone had been there and left just minutes ago. I stood there in the middle of the room, looking around, trying to find something that would justify the feeling. That's when I saw it. My window, which I always leave closed, was slightly open. I walked over to the window, trying to stay calm, and looked outside. The street was empty, with just the weak light from a lamppost illuminating the sidewalk. I slammed the window shut and locked it, but my mind wouldn't stop spinning. Who had been inside? Why? And, most importantly, how? There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. I grabbed my phone and thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That I found a light on and a window open? They'd probably think I was just another paranoid guy. I ended up deciding to stay silent and try not to panic. After locking all the doors and windows, I went to the living room and collapsed on the couch. I turned on the TV, not because I wanted to watch anything, but just to have some noise to distract me from the oppressive silence. The note was still in my pocket, and I couldn't stop thinking about the words, "I'll see you at your house later." Was it just a coincidence? Did someone know where I lived? While these questions spun in my head, I heard a noise coming from outside, like something had fallen in the backyard. My heart almost jumped out of my chest. I grabbed the flashlight I always keep by the door and went quietly to the back door, trying to make as little noise as possible. I looked through the kitchen window, which faced the backyard, but didn't see anything unusual. I took a deep breath and opened the door carefully, shining the flashlight outside. The backyard was empty, but when I turned to close the door, I saw something that hadn't been there before. On the floor, right on the threshold, was another note, folded and placed in a way that seemed to be waiting for me. I picked up the note with a shaky hand and slammed the door shut, locking all the locks again. I sat at the kitchen table before opening it, because my legs felt like they might give out. When I unfolded the paper, I saw that the handwriting was the same as the note I found in the haunted house. It started with a sentence that made my vision blur for a second. "You seem worried. I'm closer than you think." My stomach twisted, and my instinct was to look around the kitchen, as if I might find someone there with me. At the bottom of the note was a simple drawing, done hastily, but unmistakable, a figure with a blurred face, standing in front of a window. I couldn't breathe properly. It was like my body knew something was wrong, but my mind was still trying to deny it. Then, on impulse, I turned to look at the kitchen window. For a second, I was sure I saw a shadow move outside, too fast to identify. My heart raced, and I ran to the bedroom, grabbing my phone to finally call the police. My hands were shaking so much I almost dropped the phone as I dialed. I explained to the police what was happening, but while I was talking, I felt a chill go up my spine. That feeling of being watched came back, even stronger. I went straight to the bedroom, locked the door, and waited. The minutes it took for the police to arrive felt like hours. When I heard the doorbell, I rushed to open it, almost tripping over the furniture on the way. 2 officers came in and started checking the house and the backyard while I explained everything. After a thorough search, they found nothing. No signs of a break-in, no tracks in the backyard, and the note I showed them seemed like just a cruel prank. Despite the lack of evidence, they assured me they'd patrol the neighborhood and suggested I install security cameras. Once they left, I stayed in the living room, still trying to process everything. The house was silent, but something still didn't feel right. That's when I noticed my reflection on the off TV. Except, There was something behind me. Something I swear wasn't there before. I turned around so fast I almost fell. But there was nothing there. Just the emptiness of the living room. My heart was pounding in my chest, and for a moment, I thought I was losing my mind. I took a deep breath, turned off all the lights, and decided to go upstairs to the bedroom, even though I couldn't sleep. I locked the door behind me and sat on the bed, staring at the window. Hours passed, and nothing happened. The absolute silence seemed more unbearable than any noise. When the sun finally started to rise, that feeling of oppression seemed to disappear. I decided to leave the house that same day and stay with my family until I figured out what to do. I installed cameras first thing the next morning and came back that weekend to check the footage. Nothing. No movement, no sound. Everything seemed normal. To this day, I don't know what really happened that night. But sometimes, when I'm alone away from my family, I feel that same chill. Like someone is still watching me, waiting for the right moment to do something.